Hey y'all, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Vashti Sarah. Thank you for tuning in once again to All the Things podcast, where we literally talk about all the things. I have a very special guest. Her name is Esther Ramirez, and she will be doing the hard task of speaking on the topic, daddy and mommy issues. And she is a student. She's learning a lot about it, and she has great and vast experience. She works in a field where she's seen this day in, day out. And this is more so a conversation, bringing awareness of what's going on and not a diagnosis. So don't go after listening to this episode pinpointing who has mommy and daddy issues, because that's not what we're doing here. But we're just bringing awareness to the reality that this is an issue. This is a thing, and it's something to look out for and to seek medical intervention, a psychological intervention. That's why there's psychologists and counselors out there to help with people who are in these types of situations. So Esther and I met at SAGU, the university we attended, and we've been friends ever since. And she's knowledgeable. She's passionate about helping people. She's passionate about the Lord. And I'm excited to have her here on the podcast, and I hope you all enjoy everything she has to say, and even walk away with a little nugget and maybe stir something in your heart to reach out to those who are broken and hurting. So, Esther, thank you for being on the podcast. Tell listeners a little bit about who you are, where you work, if you're allowed to say that, and then we'll just jump right into what mommy and daddy issues are.
Yes, Vashti, thank you so much. I've told you this many times, but I feel so honored because you're just an amazing person. I love you. I love your brain, and I love even the fact that you are creating this space to bring up these kinds of issues, because there's just so much going on in the world right now. And
Yep.
I feel like this is definitely a topic that I think most people wouldn't assume would impact them, but it impacts our daily lives in many different ways. But yeah, so thank you for having me here, and I'm excited to see where this is all going to go. Yes, my name is Esther, and I got my bachelor's in psychology at SAGU, and then I'm actually currently working on my master's in clinical psych there as well. I just love learning. I love being able to take the information that I'm actively learning and just applying it to my day-to-day. I am a youth leader at church and with worship. And so being involved in ministry has definitely been a great way for me to exercise the things that I'm learning, because I'm able to observe, and I'm able to have great conversations with people. But also particularly in my job, I work for a school district, and it's not at a campus. We're at one of the main offices. And what I do is I work for a department that is specifically helping the homeless population within the school district. So it's called McKinney-Vento. It's a law that was passed in I think the 70s or 80s by two senators that basically provide additional resources to school districts to help out families who are going through homelessness.
Wow.
And that could be, I think what most people think of homelessness, they think it's someone, living under a bridge, or someone, on the streets or on the sidewalk. But it really looks very differently by the definition of what this law states. And so what that includes is people who are doubled up. So if they're living with a family or friend due to economic hardship, or due to domestic violence, or different situations that they may have gotten evicted from their house, or they lost their house because of a fire. They could be, so like I said, doubled up, or they could be living at a shelter, or they could be at a hotel or a motel, or different. That can include different kinds of things, but all of that is due to either economic hardship or things like that. So what I do in my job is I help our social workers, and we identify students through our processes that we have with enrollment and the forms and all that entails. And so once we identify those students, we are able to connect them and get them free lunch at school, and get them connected to the community resources, and provide counseling services as well. So that's kind of what I do. And we work with students, we work with families. Unfortunately, we don't always see the end result, we're at the very beginning of it. A lot of times we have families that come in, and they literally may be fleeing from a domestic violence situation. And so we're just trying to get their needs met, like immediate needs, and provide them resources. Yeah, so that's what I do.
Wow.
In a nutshell, if that can be summed up.
That's a big role. And I'm sure you see a lot of brokenness in situations like that. But, I want to make it clear before we even jump into this topic that you obviously see mommy and daddy issues brought up in that field. However, mommy and daddy issues aren't just in low income poverty families. It's also in middle class and upper class. But we're looking at where you currently are working and what your vantage point is. Correct?
Yeah, and actually, I would say on top of that, the school district that I work for, most people would think that it's a very affluent community. So people actually are surprised that we even get those kinds of situations, because I would say a huge portion of the people that I work with, especially are family of immigrants. And so I feel like I speak more Spanish than I do English at work, just because of the type of people that we see. But there's also a huge population where it could be literally a family who is wealthy, well off.
Wow.
But the father may be like crazy, and like the mother and her daughters are trying to flee situation.
Right.
So it's not always income based.
Okay.
And actually, poverty may not necessarily, that word, it may or may not necessarily include economic disadvantage. It could be emotional poverty. It could be just like the lack of resources or tools. Like there's different things that could encompass.
Okay. Well, that's good to point out, because I feel like for a lot of listeners, when you hear economic or poverty, I mean, we immediately look at economic status, but you're talking about poverty in your emotional state. Poverty in your family, what your family looks like, your family dynamics. So that's good to point out. So help define for us what mommy and daddy issues are in a psychological context.
Yes. So, and I like that you asked from the psychological perspective, because obviously with social media and, so many things, people use these terms so loosely.
Yep.
But basically, like what daddy and mommy issues are, it's basically like adults who are having like issues or difficulties with attaching to others. And that can be either like through romantic attachments or like relationships, or it could be like friendships, or it could be like family dynamics. So we're all relational human beings. And so we're either going to have unhealthy or healthy kinds of attachments. And those healthy or unhealthy issues that includes, it could be mainly, specifically speaking about mommy and daddy issues, due to neglect or abuse from their mother and their father, or like these childhood experiences that they have.
And that's emotional abuse, physical abuse, and the list goes on, right? Okay.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Usually people, I think they think of the physical because that's what we're able to physically observe.
Yeah.
But I mean, there are a lot of things that are unseen, and these issues, I mean, we are holistic beings. So, we're going to be affected in many different ways. And like I said, that's either neglect or abuse, because I think most people think of abuse, and that's like, physical violence, but it could also be neglect. Yep. So maybe they're not emotionally abusing, but it's because they're literally just absent, or they're not connecting, and that is just as harmful.
And it manifests itself with attachments towards different people and unhealthy attachment, correct?
Right. Yeah, because I mean, everything that how we treat others and how we relate to others is directly affected by like our upbringing, how we relate to our mother and our father. Like it's not even a question. Like that's even throughout, the psych community, that is something that is like how we relate to people is due to how we have related to our own parents and our relational dynamics with them. And it's actually interesting because this is not just like, oh, like when I was a teenager, like this stems even all the way like prenatal, like the interaction between mother and father and the interaction with the child.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've ever heard of like the Erickson's 8 stages of development, but basically what that is like it breaks up like different developmental stages, and there's different goals in each one. And so like, for example, from babies to like a year old, what they're, trying to, hopefully the goal is to create trust, but it's a trust versus mistrust. So if children are treated with consistent love and care and their needs are met by their parents, they should be able to eventually develop the capacity for trust.
Yeah.
And there are people who, there's different theories on that, like whether that's like, stacking, like whether that builds up over time or whether you just kind of keep going on to the next phase. But I personally believe that, those things, they build up over time. So like if you never developed healthy trust at that age, that's going to continue and affect every aspect of development from that point forward.
Yeah. And from your experience or your study, have you seen there's more a prevalent of mommy issues or daddy issues, or is it equal?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard to say. I think what most people think of is like daddy issues. I think that's usually what's common because there's more, statistics show that, absence of fathers. But like I said, it's not just neglect. It could also be like abuse. So maybe, and this is my personal conviction, is that because of father absence, that's just not going to create daddy issues, but that's also going to create mommy issues.
Right.
Because if you have a father that's not present in the home, whether physically or emotionally, that means that usually, from what I've seen and what I've observed, the mother usually has to kind of take up the burden and or do the job, like, because mothers, they're gonna get the job done, and one way or another, like that's just the maternal instinct. But unfortunately, what that also means is that because mothers are having to do the job of two people, she can't focus and do the job that she was designed and created to do. And so that's why we see, a lot of these single mothers who are working and they don't have time to really be there with their child. They don't have time to like sit and like just care for them because they're just trying to pay the bills, like they're just trying to get food on the table, which is important. But at the same time, that's why we do see these kinds of issues. It's not just like a mommy versus daddy, like who's better, like mothers or fathers, but it's like, no, it's a dynamic in the home. And those things definitely, whether a mother left the house, and she abandoned her kids, or whether that's the father that abandoned the kids, like that's going to affect everyone in the household, not just, one or the other.
So what are the normal behaviors and patterns that develop in an individual who have mommy and daddy issues?
Yeah, I think depending on the age, that will look a little different. So from my personal experience, I mainly work with youth or, child and adolescents.
Yeah.
So the behaviors that we see are very different than how they will be manifested in adulthood. And in a way, I feel like that's kind of an advantage because I'm able to see like the early signs of, they're not just like experiencing the effects of father absence, but they're actively, while they're developing and they're creating these thought process or, these patterns of behavior that's going to continue on into adulthood.
Yeah.
And I think it doesn't necessarily have to be like that exaggerating. Like I'm just, because the type of people that I work with, they're very like heavy cases. So, I mean, they're obviously going to be blatant behaviors, they're going to usually like alcohol or drug use. They're going to be having behavior issues at school, attendance issues, like academic issues. But even I guess for people who are more normal, quote, I'm like literally holding my fingers up because, because what is normal? Like who is normal? But in adulthood, someone may be going through life. They may have, what they consider healthy relationships, and it doesn't mean that they don't have daddy or mommy issues because that can play out in different ways.
Yeah.
But for at least the people that I work with, it is very evident in the fact that these kids, like I said, they long for love and they long for feeling that security with their parents. And so if they don't have that consistent love and care, they're not going to trust the world. Why should they trust teachers? Why should they respect people if they've been hurt and they've been abandoned and they've never received that for themselves? So from I guess like an academic perspective and the people that I work with, and honestly, it's really sad because I think even this week, like there's just been so many cases. Like I think even yesterday, like there was like it was a lot. I'm like there was like multiple people that I was like, oh gosh, this Lord help me. But because I look at these kids and I'm like, it's not their fault.
Yeah.
Like man, like a lot of times, I think teachers or administrators, it can be easy to judge a child
Yeah.
based off of their behavior and not looking at them as what this person has been abused, they have been hurt, and they have no reason to trust the world.
Right.
So I've seen like behaviors like that and how that plays out. But as far as like adulthood, I would say that there's different kinds of like signs or symptoms, I guess you could say, like, or certain key points that might help someone recognize if they do have mommy or daddy issues. And you can see that in, I think, mainly in romantic relationships, especially because you're constantly like having to love another person.
Yep.
And that can be hard whenever you have a very skewed understanding of what love is. But usually, from what I've seen, is people can be overly anxious or overly jealous regarding their partner, or
Okay.
they have fear of abandonment. People who jump from relationship to relationship because they can't stand being alone.
Yep.
Right. So they tend to like, obviously because they have fear of abandonment, they can't stand being alone. And it could be repeated cycles of unhealthy behavior. So I think, and I want to really be sensitive. I'm not, trying to judge people, but this is really, we see people like that all the time, and they may necessarily, especially with social media, they can appear to be like everything's fine.
Yeah.
And with our society, we tend to normalize these kinds of behaviors. And especially with like a mainstream culture, I think as a society, we're also kind of losing, like, because there is a more broken homes, and there are more people who are going through these kinds of situations.
Yeah.
I think it's just kind of like, well, that's just how it is. But it really does affect people in their relationships and how they relate to others.
Right.
And that looks very differently, depending on even when they were abandoned or abused or neglected, or and every situation is very different. But usually when it comes to relationships, like that's the way it I've seen come out as.
Yeah. And it could be something as drastic as, mom and dad are home and then your dad gets arrested. You've lived with just your mom. Or it could be another drastic, because both issues, both family units, whenever it's ripped apart, it can be you can develop mommy and daddy issues. So for instance, you are in a home, your dad's a pastor, but because your dad is heavily invested in the church, your mom picks up the slack. You develop mommy daddy issues or daddy issues, both, because, well, my dad, yes, he's doing a great thing. He's a pastor. He's tending to the sheep, but the home is getting neglected and mom has to take on the brunt of it. So I think a lot of times we look at these and we think, oh, it's just the extreme that experience mommy and daddy issues. But that can develop with any type of family unit where one individual or one parent is missing significantly in the home and there's neglect involved or abuse involved.
Oh, for sure. And girl, you're opening up a can of worms, because I already know these PKs out there and MKs out there. They're going to be like, oh, we're getting triggered right now. 'Cause I can see it. And actually, I don't know, I think you knew this, but I'm a PK myself.
Yep.
So my parents, and actually, I don't look at it as my parents are the pastors, but we're a pastoral family.
Yep.
And this is something that honestly, I brag about it. Like, and I can say this out loud. I can say it to the public because I am proud of how my family has handled ministry. Not to say that it was perfect, because there were moments. And, we got, I'm a person, I think out of all my siblings, I am very vocal about whenever I am feeling a certain way. So my parents knew that, there were times where I'm like, I feel like you're not dedicating enough time to me right now, and I will say, I think our experience was a little differently. I always tell people, like, I grew up as an MK, and not like a missionary kid, but as a musician's kid, because my dad was always the worship leader at church, so everybody wanted his attention.
Yep.
And, and that takes time. As musicians or worship leaders, you're the first ones there and you're the last ones to leave, actually, even before the pastor.
Yep.
And so, I grew up having to always be like at church, and whenever my family took up the pastoral role at the church that we were at, I really became bitter with ministry. And I know that's not like the topic of today, but I grew a lot of bitterness, and I said, God, like, it's not fair. Yeah. Like, why do I have to give my time to people who they only come to you whenever they want something? Yeah. Because we've seen that in the church a lot, where people just come to church because they want something from God. Yep. And as soon as God answers their prayers, they leave. And that was just very like my personality. I'm a very loyal, like I love loyalty and I respect, and that means a lot to me. So if someone's just coming in here, and we've dedicated time and we've invested in that person, and all for them to just leave, that was really hard for me. Yeah. Especially because I was in high school. So, I'm still developing and I'm still, learning. And, I also had to sacrifice my parents because I didn't have their full attention. Something I would bring up to my parents a lot was like, I was in volleyball and softball in high school. And there were times where like, I think I could count like maybe 3 times in my time in high school where they actually went to go watch me play, and I would always see all the parents. They were always there. They would always, be involved. And because my parents were in ministry, like they didn't really have that time. Yeah. And so that grew a lot of bitterness in me. But honestly, I do believe that the Lord convicted me, because I was praying one time and I was like, God, like, this is not fair. Like, why do I have to sacrifice them? And God was like, like, you are not more deserving of love than those broken children of mine out there. Yeah. And God really opened my eyes to see that it's not like it's me fighting against the ministry, but God also wanted me to partake and be involved in being able to help his sheep, because he blessed me with these wonderful parents. And it's not to say that I'm going to share or not share, because obviously there's healthy boundaries, right? Like, it's not to say like, oh, because I already know people are going to be like, but, because there are healthy boundaries that you have to establish, and your priority is your home. Like, your family is before the church. And I think that's why a lot of people, especially in the church, have felt neglected by their parents, right? Because they feel like they're not really getting all their needs met emotionally, and I resonate with that because I kind of did experience that for myself. But I really do believe that getting into the Word and allowing the Lord to open my understanding that it's not just about me, but also God wants to use me as well. And then whenever when we started our church in our house, I'm not just sharing my parents now, I'm sharing my your personal space. And let me tell you, that was a challenge, because one time we even had someone coming up to our house at 1:00 in the morning. I'm like, no, oh boy, that is not okay. But my parents, I think the Lord has definitely given them a heart for people. Yeah. And so it wasn't as easy for me to kind of catch on with the vision, but my parents were very like, you know what, like, we want to love people, and people are not in the healthy space that we are at, and so we want to help and we want to be there for them. And like I said, I've been vocal with them, so there are times where I'm like, you know what, like, no, we can't have a meeting that day because we haven't had family time, and we need to spend time together. I'm gonna be intentional. It does require more work, but I think at the end of the day, when it comes to parents and their children, it really requires a lot of intentionality. Yeah. And I'm not saying that parenting is easy, because I know with me, my parents have not had it easy. Yeah. But I have seen how like it does pay off to be intentional and to still, like, I remember one time there was a season where my dad would actually take us out on a date, like individually, like my sister, he would take out me, and then he'd take out my brother. And it was like, I felt so much confidence, because I'm like, yeah, like, we're riding on my dad's motorcycle and like we're going to the movies, and I just felt like undivided attention. Yeah. And while I couldn't get that all the time, but he did try to go out of his way to show me that he did care. Yeah. And that this is all something that we just have to get through. Right. So I know that's kind of like going on a tangent. I said I wouldn't go, but it's just, I don't know. I feel like compelled to just share that, because absolutely, people in ministry who are probably feeling neglected themselves, or I know there's like spiritual abuse and all of that
Yep.
includes as well.
And that just shows like, maybe that was your dad's approach of breaking that cycle of
Yes.
neglect. And maybe he even saw it from his perspective, yes, I'm in a ministry role, but family comes first. And this is my way of breaking that cycle of neglect in my home. So
Oh
let's,
yeah.
let's talk about that. How can individuals who are struggling with mommy and daddy issues, unresolved issues, how can they make that step towards healing? And then, being individuals who maybe aren't parents yet, how can they break that cycle? Or maybe they are parents, how can they start breaking
Mhm.
that cycle?
Yeah, and honestly, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think when people, at least the perception that people have of my family, they think that we're like this picture perfect
Mm-hmm.
family, like with a picket fence and all that stuff. But just for context, I guess, to if people out there don't believe me, um, my both my mom and my dad, they grew up with single mothers. So both my
Mm-hmm.
grandmothers, they grew up as single mothers, or they raised their kids as single mothers.
Yeah.
Um, and from my dad's side, just to give you some context, because I know it can be confusing. Um, my grandmother from my dad's side,
Mm-hmm.
her husband was, I mean, abusive, alcoholic, gambling. At one point, even sold one of my aunts at some point because he was that
Wow.
drunk. Like, it's just a lot. Like, I mean, I could sit here and talk about just hours talking about my family and all that. Really just shows like God's mercy and faithfulness, because
Mm-hmm.
I honestly do believe that I would not end up here if it wasn't for the Lord.
Yeah.
But so there's a lot of trauma, and there's a lot of daddy issues from my dad's side. And then
Mm-hmm.
from my mom's side, it's a whole other mess. But yeah, my grandmother had to raise her kids.
Mm-hmm.
And there's what I think is interesting about these two perspectives is that, man, like my grandmother, my dad's mom, she raised 8 kids by herself.
Mm.
And at one point, when they moved to the US, because my family's originally from Guatemala, but whenever they came to the US, like they struggled like a lot. Like
Mm-hmm.
there was at one point where even my aunts and uncles were homeless,
Mm-hmm.
and they were literally like like just hearing the stories of my father and my aunts and uncles and how much hurt they have endured.
Yeah.
And even my grandmother, she passed away recently, but just getting to listen to her even at the end of her life, all the stories that that they endured.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, how? Like
Mm-hmm.
how did we get here? How did my dad, end up being like an awesome father? Like I said, he's
Mm-hmm.
not perfect, but I'm very blessed that God blessed me with him. But
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest things is definitely like the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because whenever my parents got married, and I've actually had a lot of conversations with my parents about this, my parents struggled. They definitely, my dad did not really want to have kids. He was a musician before Christ. He was like playing at nightclubs, and he had this
Wow.
like, idea of life. And so whenever my parents got married, like he wasn't really interested in being a father.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, one time he told me, he's like, actually, I didn't want to be a father because like I had a horrible father. So
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to like repeat that again,
Yep.
So even I could see people out there like even being hesitant to want kids
Mm-hmm.
because of their own experiences that they've had.
Yep.
And even my mom, she didn't grow up with her father. And so, there's a lot of things that you get, a lot of developmental important um, parts of you that you develop from your parents. And but one thing that I was talking to my parents about is that they always try to put Christ at the center,
Mm-hmm.
and they always, with prayer and godly wisdom and surrounding themselves with people in a great community that could help. And it does take a village to raise kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes parents can feel like they're alone
Yeah.
with raising kids, because it's a huge burden and it's a huge responsibility. And when I mean burden, I don't mean like, oh, like it's a weight,
Yeah.
dead weight, but it's such a huge responsibility that I can see how it can
Mm-hmm.
feel like a lot sometimes.
Yeah.
But I think knowing that it's not supposed to be done alone, like surrounding yourself with community people, like my aunts and uncles were very much involved in our lives and helping. Like my grandmothers, they helped not just financially, but even emotionally. caring for us and like loving us. I think that played a huge role. But also both my mom and dad, while they didn't grow up with fathers, they had great manly, or what's that word? Like role models or like fatherly figures.
Yeah.
They had fatherly figures that they could treat. So, you know, my dad, he looked up to my oldest uncle, and he really acted as a father. And my mom, she had her uncles that, you know, acted like her father. And so I think that plays a huge role that, you know, unfortunately with people who are already in situations where they may or may not have fathers, but having those mentors and having people in your life that can pour into you, I think that's healthy. And I think that's also why it's important. Like my grandmother always said, after she separated from her husband, she decided to never marry, never get into another relationship, because she did not want to put her children in a vulnerable position again. And so it doesn't mean that you can't have a spouse or, you know, or get remarried or whatever. But I think surrounding your children with healthy relationships, I think that plays a huge role as well, because, you know, I know some people, they even celebrate Father's Day, but like as the mom, right? Like they'll say, oh, my mom, I'm celebrating Father's Day because, you know, you raised both of us, or you took the role of both people. But I always tell people like, no, like there's Father's Day and there's Mother's Day. Because even
two distinctions.
Yes, because even though you're doing both the responsibilities, but you're not doing it in the way that it was designed to, and there's going to be some form of neglect, or and they're trying their best, you know. I'm not saying that they're not, because God knows their heart, and I know that a mother's heart is like so strong, but you know, at the same time, like you will never be able to fill that hole. You will never be able to replace that person. And I think that's also what stems from people carrying on that hurt, is because there's no one that can really replace that hole. And for me personally, I do believe that God can. And so that's just something that we've seen in my family, that, you know, where even though my parents didn't necessarily have, you know, the best examples, but they tried their best, and they always tried to, whenever they made decisions together, they did it as a team, and they did surround themselves with godly people, and they tried as much as possible to form their decisions based off of scripture and through prayer, making those decisions. And I'm a witness, because, you know, when we were growing up, it wasn't easy always with my dad, but he always tried his best. And so one example that I always think about when I think about my dad, and a way that I saw that he really loved us, is that when we do something wrong, he would spank us. But I would remember that before he would spank us, he would take time and talk to us and say, okay, like, why do you think we're here right now? Like, what did you do? Why do you think I'm going to spank you today? Like, and it really helped me to recognize that, you know, and I would see how he said, you know, it hurts me more to spank you than it will hurt you. But I do this because I love you, and I want you to be a successful adult. And so, yeah, I mean, I did not like getting spanked. I mean, who would? You know, I hated it. But at the same time, I valued that he took the time to show me and teach me that it's not just a matter of getting hurt or beat, or but discipline. There's a lesson. Yes. And even the word discipline, it means teach, you know? So I think something to encourage parents is that, you know, you're teachers. You're not just parents. You're not dictators. You're not breadwinners. You're not just a cook. You know, you're not just a housekeeper. You're not just a sugar daddy. You know, but you are a teacher. And everything that you do, your children will also learn. They will absorb. And whether you're intentionally, it's not like your teacher in the sense of like, all right, kids, we're going to learn about life today. But it's through your actions, through your words, how you relate to other people, how you treat other people, the dynamics that you have, those things, your children will absorb that. And even younger children, that's why they're so sensitive, because they pick up on things that most adults don't even think about. You know, and children are just more sensitive than adults when it comes to like emotions. They're just constantly, they're like sponges. And so, you know, that's why it's so important that, you know, people take care of who they surround themselves with, and be intentional with how they relate to others, because your children will also pick up on those things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why also cycles, they occur.
Absolutely.
You may have a situation of a family who, maybe like, they were probably like beat by their father and whatnot, or there's a lot of that can include as far as like alcohol use and previous traumas. But let's say they're hurting their family, and then these kids are going to grow up to create a worldview, and they're going to create patterns of behavior based off of what they grew up with. They're going to see that that's familiar, and supposedly that's the way that life is, and they grow up treating people the same way. And unfortunately, let's say we have a situation where there's an unplanned pregnancy, and then because that person has not truly learned what real love is and how to healthily relate to other people, they treat their kids the same way because that's all they knew how to do. That's how they were raised. And then these kids are growing up, and then you just continue the cycle.
Yep.
And so I think breaking those cycles is important. And then there's the big question of like, how do I do that? Like, how do I break those cycles? Because there's just a lot. Yeah. And I think one of the biggest things is like awareness and educating yourself on what that looks like. And I always say, like, I'm not a professional, so I mean, I'm happy to have conversations with people, but I think there are people who are professionals who have taken the time and gained understanding and knowledge and strategies and methods to be able to ask the right questions and to get people to understand, like, why is it that I behave this way? Like, what is the root of all of this? And, what childhood experiences did I have that have shaped, how I view the world? And I think taking time to be aware of those things, like, there are things that I'll be going out about in my life, and I'm like, wait, hold on. Like, why am I feeling this way? Maybe I reacted towards somebody, or maybe a thought came to my mind, and I have to stop myself and say, wait, hold on. Like, where's this coming from? Or why am I feeling this way? Yeah. And thankfully for me, because I mean, being a psychology major, I feel like you're basically like, you're therapizing yourself. Like, you're constantly
you're psychoanalyzing yourself.
Yes. Because, you're constant, but you're looking at it from an objective perspective, because the textbook is not like lecturing you and advising you. The textbook is just showing you this is the signs and symptoms. The textbook is showing you, like, factually, this is what it is. And then we, from our own experiences, we're able to take in that information and apply that. So I think for me personally, while I don't necessarily believe that I've gone through like a childhood traumatic experience, although there were some traumatic experiences, doesn't mean that I'm traumatized. Right. There were stressful events in my life that I'm like, wow, that definitely shaped how I think and who I am today. But taking the time to like stop and really understand, like, why is it that we do what we do? But on any average person, they're probably not running through those things in the back of their mind, because we're just acting, right? We're just reacting, right? And when you're not aware of where your behaviors come from, and I always say, even at my church, I tell the youth all the time, like, what you do is a reflection of what you feel, and what you feel is a reflection of what you think. And so there's also the thoughts, right? It's not just behaviors, but it's the thought process and like what is actually going on in your mind that is causing these behaviors. Yeah. And so being aware of those things, I think, is a huge game changer, because when you're able to understand why you do what you do and how you relate to people, how you relate, then you're able to recognize if they're healthy or unhealthy. And then if they are unhealthy, okay, what are interventions or what are things that we need to do to not continue those kinds of healthy behaviors? Yeah. If that makes sense.
And we can't just chalk it up to, well, that's just who I am. No, there's a deeper, there's a reason why you're responding the way you're responding. There's a reason why you have that stronghold in your life. It's not just, well, that's just how God made me. No.
It's not to justify.
Exactly. Absolutely.
And that's the biggest thing. Because let me tell you, I've heard so many people say, like, well, that's just who I am. Or, like the typical expression, like, well, only God can judge me. Right. I'm like, yes. Only God can judge you.
We have to give an account for our actions or attitudes or the words we speak, everything. And if we don't deal with that now, then we can't just go face the Lord and be like, well, that's how you made me, Lord. And he's like, well, no, you weren't a good steward.
Yeah. And I think, essentially, like, like, if you don't even recognize it, the unhealthy things in your life, like, how can you change? How can you grow? Yeah. Or if you're in denial, maybe but you don't want to admit it, or you don't want to take ownership of that.
Or it's too messy to even go back
Yes.
into what spurred.
It's painful.
Yeah, it is painful
to think about it, to relive those experiences. Like,
yeah.
I'm not going to share this, but I remember there was this childhood experience I had one time, and that really, like, man, that carried on with me for a long time. And through prayer, and obviously through like these psych classes, I'm like, ooh, like, I think there's a root here that is not supposed to be here.
This needs to be addressed.
And God, and I would pray, and I would say, God, like, I would just cry because it was just so painful to feel. And I'm like, I don't want to feel this way. Like, why? Like, why am I feeling this way? But I think allowing yourself to feel that pain again, it's not to just relive it. Like, our memory, oh my gosh. And like, when it comes to trauma, like, our memory, like, when it comes to dopamine, like, we will remember things as if it was happening in that moment. And we see this a lot, like in trauma situations, where you literally, your body can react as if you were in that moment again. And even I remember one time, I think, you know how I used to have all these car accidents when I was in college? I don't know if you remember. Man, my body has been through a lot. But I remember one time we were coming back from like a late night prayer. And I was driving with my sister. We were on our way back home on the freeway, and it was still kind of dark, and it was raining and stuff. And all of a sudden there was like this couch in the middle of the road. And I swerved out of the way to, you know, avoid hitting the couch. But unfortunately, like, my car just spun out of control. Like, I just lost control of the wheel. And so we ended up getting into this huge car accident. And like, the Lord, I mean, we were just calling out the name of Jesus, like, Jesus, like, that's all we could say. My sister and I were just like, while the car was still spinning. And so, you know, fast forward a year, I was driving in like uptown Dallas area, and there was just like a lot of traffic. There was a lot of cars on the road. It was raining and it was kind of dark, and I was wearing the same jacket that I wore when I had the car accident with my sister. And I just, like, my body just gets triggered, and I'm like, oh gosh, like, I'm having a panic attack. And I start hyperventilating. I'm like, I start crying like uncontrollably, and I'm like, what is going on with me? Like, my hands were shaking. And I was like, okay, I have to park because I cannot be on the road right now. So I parked. Like, thankfully, you know, we were like, you know, it was still kind of like residential. So I ended up parking, and I had to, like, thankfully I had my prayer journal. So I started writing down, like, okay, what are you feeling right now? Like, what are your biological symptoms right now? Like, okay, you're hyperventilating, you're nervous, like, you know, what is causing? And I realized, like, oh my gosh, even just the touch of the jacket on me reminded me of how it felt like in the moment, the fact that I was in that car accident. And I had to pray through that, and I had to say, Lord, like, you are, I need you right now. Like, you need to come in right now and like help me get through this. And I was like, you know, just saying scripture out loud, and I was just like praying through it, like, God, like, I don't have to fear anything. Like, it's okay that you're feeling this way. You're feeling this because of that experience, and just being like honest with myself and saying, but you know what, Esther, like, right now you're okay. Like, you are parked, you're not in danger, and I have to, like, physically tell myself those things. So whereas I could have easily used as an excuse of like, well, that's just who I am. I just have anxiety because of that accident. But for me, that wasn't enough. Like, I wanted to actually heal and get through that. And so I had to make the decision to actually, like, have conversations with, I even had a professor. We had a great conversation, and he kind of like talked to me about, like, you know, what is it that you're feeling and things like that. And so talking those things out and understanding and having that education of like how these things affect you. For me personally, I know it's like very, very off topic with daddy and mommy issues, but it just comes to show that awareness and understanding of where your behaviors derive from. It gives you so much knowledge and potential to overcome that. And I think that's why there is hope.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of us are just stubborn, and we don't want to address the issue. It's easy to say, well, this is just who I am, deal with it. And we have to have these conversations because we're not called to remain stagnant human beings. The Lord has called us to develop line upon line, precept upon precept. We should continuously be stewarding where we're at. And a part of stewardship is stewarding our behavior, our lifestyle, you know, the trajectory of our life. And if we can choose, don't get me wrong, we can choose to just stay in that rut, or we can choose to use what is accessible to us: prayer, fasting, talking to counselors, seeking mentors, addressing the issue. Because if you don't address the issue, it will keep repeating itself over and over and over and over. So from a biblical perspective, what would you say, the Bible, how has the Bible addressed this, and how can we as Christ followers deal with daddy and mommy issues from a biblical standpoint?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, first of all, like, the Bible clearly, like, I forget honestly where that verse is in the Bible, but it's somewhere in the Bible. It says, like, teach your child in the ways of the Lord, so even when they're to get older, they won't apart from him.
Yep.
And I think this verse, I think a lot of people working specifically with youth, working in ministry, I think sometimes people don't understand what that really entails. And people think that it's enough to just take their kids to church.
Yeah.
And let the pastor and let, the youth leader kind of fix them. And it's not. Like, the responsibility lies on the parents.
Oh, absolutely.
To discipline and to teach their children in the ways of the Lord. But it's, like I said, teach is not just taking them to church, but they have to themselves, like, how do people teach, or how do people learn? People learn from models. People learn from what behavior is shown to them. So if a parent is not showing a godly example of a disciple of Jesus, then how can we expect the children to do something else? Separate. So I think the biggest thing, I think, from a biblical perspective is, like, there is a huge responsibility that parents have when it comes to raising their kids. And I think it's a blessing because, man, the fact that the Lord entrusts people to care and raise a child, I think that's something that's so beautiful. But I think even in the Bible, there's many great examples of people who are fathers, but not a lot of them are great examples.
Yeah.
And so I think the best, like, example that I can think of that shows, like, that the Bible speaks on this as far as, like, mommy and daddy issues is the fact that God is the best father we could ever have.
Yeah.
And he does this because he constantly throughout scripture shows us his love through many different ways. And it just shows that, love is sacrificial, and love, I mean, I could talk on and on about God's love because it is something that he truly shows, like, what it is to care for his children.
Yeah.
And I think when we try to follow Christ's example of what that looks like, I don't think you could fail from that. I think it's not going to make you a perfect parent, because obviously, none of us are perfect.
Yeah.
But I think when we at least are trying to align to what scripture says, and not even culturally, man, like, there are so many things that people, like I said, people parent because of what they've learned, or, what they have themselves experienced. And there's a huge temptation in that. But I think looking at parenting from a biblical perspective, and not so much of the lens of how you were raised, I think is very difficult. I think that's a huge challenge, but I think it's also very important.
Yeah.
And in the example of my family, where my parents could have continued the behaviors that their fathers did, but they chose to, be godly, and they chose, and maybe at certain times it was not easy. The temptation was to just react and just act out in anger. But we see constantly that what are the qualities of God? And one of my favorite parts to use, like, as an example is, the fruits of the Spirit, and I think whenever we look at our behaviors, not just from daddy or mommy issues, but just how we treat people, I think they should be aligned with the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience. Oh, the patience. That's the one that is the hardest, I feel, because when you're, like, I've seen mothers, when their 2-year-old is just screaming, and your temptation is just to, like, try to shut them up. But it's like, no, like, be patient with them, be gentle with them, and show them love, because you can correct and discipline with love. It doesn't have to just be this brutal, but when that's all you've grown up to learn, and so even the scripture, it goes against these unhealthy behaviors. And we were saying earlier, it's not to justify, but it's to understand that why is it that I am the way I am,
Mm-hmm.
but it's to understand so that you can overcome that.
Yeah.
Right. Like the truth shall set you free,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And so,
Absolutely.
scripture definitely like, lays out, a great way to overcome. And it's
Mm-hmm.
not just overcoming, your mom, your daddy issues, but, you know, God has given us the ability to overcome, not because of our own strength or because of our own understanding, but when we rely on God
Yep.
and say, God, I can't control my past.
Mm-hmm.
I can't control the things that were done to me, but I can choose to follow you, and I can choose to reflect Christ like behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have that perspective in all of your relationships, that will naturally, break those cycles.
Yeah.
And it's easier said than done. I will say that, but I think, that's why you can't do it alone.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I was trying to get at with, my family, is that, my parents didn't do it alone. Like, they had pastors,
Mm-hmm.
they had, even my grandmothers, like, they had people surrounding them that, were God fearing and have wisdom from the Lord. Because not just because, like, my grandmothers, thankfully they are godly women, but if they weren't, just because they're my grandmothers, it doesn't mean that they have holy wisdom.
Right.
And
Mm-hmm.
so it's also being intentional with who you're surrounding yourself with,
Mm-hmm.
and how much time you're actually spending with the Lord, and allowing God to really, um influence your behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
And it really starts from your mind, like scripture says, to be transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Yep.
And we can't, change our behaviors if we don't, start to recognize these thoughts that are, constantly ongoing.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that makes sense,
No, it
because
it
there's just
does
so
help, and that's
much.
exactly what Jared and I are doing before we, conceived. One of the biggest things was we're praying over generational curses, and there are specific
Yeah.
things in my family that's, oh, we're not bringing that into this house. And then
Yeah.
same for him, things that patterns and lifestyles, thought processes that we're not going to entertain in this home. And we are strategically and actively choosing to not walk in those habits, those quote unquote, well, that's just how we are,
Right.
we're choosing to break that cycle because no, we're not going to do parenting well or perfect. We're not going to be the perfect parents, but our goal is to be as intentional and not to bring those negative and deep rooted issues from our own family's history and lineage into this new
Right.
lineage. We were choosing to break that cycle, and we might break some of them. We might not break all of them, but we're choosing to actively walk in that. And it takes a lot of prayer. It takes a lot of intentionality. We talk about it. We don't shy around the topic. We're very honest about it, and we call things out when we see it. And I think that's one of the biggest ways listeners can take that step is talk about it. Don't be afraid to address the issue, and find people to confide in, find counselors, find a pastor, whoever it may be, and bring up the issue. This shouldn't be something that we're tiptoeing around and justifying because, well, everyone else struggles with it. We need to bring awareness to this. Otherwise, it'll keep being a pattern of history where, if you grew up in a divorce home, three out of your 4 siblings will get a divorce. And it's, well, that's just how it is. Everyone in my family gets divorced, but it doesn't have to be that way. Everyone in my family struggles with anxiety. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. And I think for a lot of us, we just justify and we're okay with it. We're genuinely okay with it. And it's sad to me that we've just, been relaxed and, oh, well, that's just life. And that's how God
It's
called us
interesting
to
that you
be.
mentioned that, Vashti, because I feel like just saying and trying to justify, like, is not going to change your situation. Like,
Yep.
people complain about their situation, but
And
they
do
don't
nothing about
actively
it.
try to get through it.
Yeah.
Like, even just like some facts, like about like father absence, right? Like, it's interesting because father absence greatly affects people in different ways. And I think as a society, one of the things that we're doing is that we're taking these symptoms and we're taking these issues and we're blaming someone.
Yep.
Right? We're blaming life where we sometimes we even blame God, like, God, why? Like, if God is really love, then why did he allow this and this to happen? Like, I don't know if you've ever heard of adverse childhood experiences, like they're called the ACEs, but they're basically like stressful events that occurred during childhood.
Yeah.
And it really affects, or it impacts like a person's ability to think, interact with others, their learning. And one of the key factors to overcoming these ACEs is resilience. And just like for someone who may not know like what the ACEs are, these type of stressful events could mean domestic violence. It could be a separation or divorce. It could be maybe their parent has dealt with like a mental disorder, like a mental health issue. They may be victims of abuse, and we mentioned either physical, emotional, or sexual. There's different, even with a family member having gone to prison, like there's different factors that affect a person's life, and affects everything. And then those things, they turn out to increase the chances of someone going to prison. They increase heart issues. They increase. I think one time I was reading an article, and it was saying that having these ACEs, or like if you have more than a certain number of these ACEs, it increases even your chance of having type 2 diabetes.
Wow.
And so even seeing how like that manifests into the physical, and then people are blaming society, or they're blaming, not society, they're blaming whoever. Because of how they are, and we don't really look at what is the root of the issue, and that's that there is so much brokenness in our homes, especially nowadays in America. Like, we're seeing such a huge increase in these kinds of situations. Like, people are like, when there's father absence, they're more likely to be in poverty. They're more likely to have behavioral issues. They're more likely to have even like dropping out of school, like, teen pregnancy. Like, we see this, from the school district perspective. But then like, we're not addressing the root of the issue. And so it's like, how can we ever overcome these issues if we're not addressing what is causing these issues? And the Bible, there's a reason why we have a nuclear household as a good model for a family. And it's because it's all about, giving and taking. It's all about pouring in to each other, different members of the family and the household. So I look at it as also like, that's why it is so important to be educated and to become aware and talk about these things, because if not, our society is just going to keep on going to these cycles. And unfortunately, with time, they're just going to keep mass producing. It's not like it's just going to, the statistics, they keep increasing, they keep growing. And we're seeing this daily. I mean, even from the school district, like I said, we're seeing this every single day. And so I think it's important that we talk about these things, and even within the like church, like start having these conversations, and supporting and encouraging family unity. And there's so many things that could, affect, a family's home life situation, and there's definitely, like, not to say that everybody needs to, like stick with an abuse, like it, those are very specific cases that I feel like, okay, if it's your safety, that's different. But I think it's so important that, we look at marriage even as something that is holy, and it's not just something like that we can just divorce when we disagree. Like, there's a lot of these issues that I feel like our society has nowadays that is greatly impacting these kids, and then these kids grow up with those cycles, and and then it just continues into that cycle. So it's so important.
And I think it's important to pinpoint that at some point it has an expiration date. We can't keep justifying why we are the way we are by blaming someone else. At some point that expires, and you have to deal with it, and you have to choose to fight against that attitude, fight against that family pattern. We can't just keep justifying it. And like you said, it'll keep being an issue with the what's it called? The rates increasing, because what we're doing is we're just being okay with it and lackadaisical in addressing the issue. But phenomenal conversation, Esther. Thank you so much for sharing your heart, for being honest, and for also sharing your personal experience, from it might not be major mommy daddy issues, but showing and pinpointing how these issues can be brought up within a home. It doesn't have to be specific to economics. It can be entirely different. And we all can become victims of it. if we don't choose to change the trajectory, the course of our life, and to break those habits and patterns. And one of the biggest ways in doing that is talking about it, that just bringing up the topic and bringing awareness to it and sharing and, encouraging those who might be struggling with mommy and daddy issues, those unhealthy attachments, those attitudes that are hard to break, and seeing that family pattern of whether it be divorce, anxiety, health issues, whatever it may be. And that's not saying that if you have that, that's a, mommy and daddy issue,
right?
But seeking intervention, seeking help, and talking to people, medical professionals and psychologists who can help you pinpoint the root issue, the why behind the what. But Esther, you're phenomenal. You have a passion to help people, and you have a passion to bring awareness to a lot of issues in this world. And one of them is this right here. And that's because it's near and dear to your heart. You're working closely to it. But thank you so much. I hope y'all enjoyed today's episode. And we're just skimming the top of mommy and daddy issues. We can go in and talk about this for hours on end, but we're bringing up the topic, and hopefully tonight or whenever you're listening to this episode, this weekend, you can bring it up with your family and address those things. Bring it up with a friend, bring it up with a coworker, bring it up with your parents and talk through these things. Bring it up with your spouse and, address, hey, what are patterns in your life that you want to break in your home or in your family, and et cetera. So again, thank you so much, Esther. Phenomenal conversation, and just a lot to learn and glean from what mommy and daddy issues are and how we can address it.
Thank you, Vashti.
Absolutely.